Morning, friends. It's very exciting to see such a large turnout. And to add to Mr. Menon's point, I didn't know any of the answers. So he just didn't know few of them, but I didn't know any of them. So you guys are doing very good. And I think this whole idea of generating awareness on architecture is really, really interesting. And I think it will bear, and it will start to bear some fruit in the coming years. So one question, how many of you are budding architects? Are any of you planning to be architects, or this is just a general curiosity of participating in an architecture quiz? So I'll start by showing you pictures of some buildings which have been demolished recently, and I think everybody has already spoken about them. The one on the top is the Chanakya Movie Hall, which was demolished in 2007. It was built in 1970, and it had a life of about 37 years. And this was a very, very favorite movie hall of all of us, middle-aged people now, but we were young at that point of time. This is the cinema hall, which we used to see the very first movie. This is the cinema hall we used to go for our very first date. So it held a very, very memorable place in our heart. And in 2007, when it was demolished, we kind of felt a big jolt, and architects ran a kind of a campaign to protest against the demolition. But as time is telling, history repeats itself. Not only Chanakya, but buildings after that are continuing to be demolished. The second one you see, and probably you've read it in newspapers recently, is the Hall of Nations, which was again a very iconic building, and I will get to why it is considered iconic. It is considered iconic because of several reasons, which we will discuss later. And this got demolished very recently in 2017, and this again was a very, very interesting building, very, very iconic building. And even as we are continuing to speak of demolishing buildings, actually I observed this yesterday itself, that Paras Cinema at Nehru Place also got demolished. I mean, we can argue that not every building can be preserved, but at least some kind of a discussion, some kind of idea on how these valuable buildings, very good pieces of design and architecture, can be preserved. So before I get into defining, we are taking up overview of postmodernist architecture in Delhi, but I thought maybe I will just quickly define what modern architecture is all about, and particularly in the context of Delhi. So here you can see, I'm just quickly giving you some buzzwords. So general cubic shapes, asymmetric compositions. So generally architecture, if you compare in your head, just compare Taj Mahal and just compare maybe the WHO head office, the buildings in modern era became very cubic, they became like boxes, they became rectangular, they had straight, simple lines. The second aspect which was very important was that there was an absence of ornamentation. If you compare it to all the historic buildings which you must have seen in India, temples, mosques, they were adorned with a lot of ornamentation, a lot of carving. And this was something which was totally wiped out in modern architecture. And what was considered as ornamentation was the texture of the surface, the materiality of the surface, the light reflecting from the surface. The other thing which really changed modern architecture is the use of materials. So new materials came into architecture, new materials like reinforced cement concrete, steel, glass, etc. started to be used, and that really changed and transformed architecture. Because until modern era, buildings were built in a very different manner with very traditional materials like stone, like brick, like mud. But the use of concrete really transformed architecture and gave the ability to mass produce architecture at a very fast pace. Last one that you see, again, which I have already said, buildings had flat roofs and clean lines. Everything is very simple, everything is very clean, and that really, in a nutshell, kind of distinguishes modern architecture for you. So coming to Delhi, I think we are all aware that New Delhi was designed by Lutyens and Baker. And when India got independent in 1947, we acquired this city. We inherited this city. And most of the buildings that were existing in New Delhi were transformed to become the head offices or the government offices for the government of India. So for example, the Viceregal Lodge became the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The circular council chamber became the Parliament of India, and so on. And more than that, I think not only did the function got inherited, but even the symbolic value, which was really something the new nation was kind of craving for. So all the events of the nation, all the big events of the nation were held in the city itself, which was the Rajpath and the Janpath. Here you can see some of the events that continue to be held even until this day, and how this city has acted as the symbolic center for the entire nation. So here, after independence, I think you are all aware of history. Until about 1980s, the entire Indian politics was governed by largely the Congress, and within the Congress itself, it was kind of the Nehru-Gandhi family was at the helm of the entire government. And up until the 1980s, the three prime ministers, which is Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and Rajiv Gandhi, kind of ruled India. And one of the things which really distinguished their rule in India is that they took personal interest in architecture. They took personal interest in how cities were built. And Nehru, for example, had very close relationship with all the government departments which were executing different works in Delhi. He had very good equation with most of the architects who were practicing at that point. For example, Habib Rahman, Joseph Allenstein. So you can see, if you search for pictures, you will find several of his pictures with different architects discussing different projects all over Delhi. And he also was instrumental in establishing the Delhi Development Authority in 1957, which really became the single body which governed the growth and expansion of Delhi, which really came out with a 20-year master plan from time to time to plan how the city would grow. So more than independence, I think what really affected India, or what affected the development of Delhi, was the partition of India. And if you must have read that the population of India, of Delhi, grew from 700,000 in 1941 to 2.5 million in 1961. That was a huge growth, about a 4 or 5-fold growth in a span of 20 years. And the city was just not equipped to deal with it, just not equipped. It didn't have enough houses. At the same time, the government machinery was growing. It didn't have enough buildings to house government offices. And really speaking, the entire city became a very large refugee camp. And here you can see an image of Humayun's tomb, which was a very large refugee camp in 1947. And you can see the condition of people living in very despicable conditions at that point of time. So the first, the task which the government undertook was to establish large residential colonies. And you must have heard of different colonies like South Extension, Karol Bagh, New Friends Colony, Malviya Nagar, which were really established as refugee colonies, and several different typologies. And here you can see the Lajpat Nagar housing. And these are the houses which were built by the government to house all the refugees which had migrated from West Pakistan. The other type of colonies which the government built was large colonies like Sarojini Nagar, where they provided housing for the government staff. So this is a typical example of a government housing, and you can see the entire area from Ring Road till Chanakyapuri and from the Safdarjung Airport till Chanakyapuri on the other side, which is dotted with all the houses. And this area now, we can already see, is undergoing a lot of redevelopment, which is the entire stretch along the Ring Road is undergoing very large expansion of buildings. The first reaction to independence by architects was what we call a revivalist phase. And architects who were practicing, or the government architects who were working for different government departments, they started to fuse elements of Indian architecture, Buddhist architecture, Hindu architecture, Muslim architecture with the colonialist style of Baker and Lutyens architecture. So here you can see all the different buildings which you must have crossed at various points: the Udyog Bhavan, the Rail Bhavan, Krishi Bhavan, and also Krishi Bhavan at the bottom, which you are all dotted all around the Rajpath. And these are a curious mix of Lutyenesque architecture and also elements of Indian architecture from history. Again, some examples which you can see of the revivalist phase, which is the Supreme Court, again done by CPWD. The chief architect was G.B. Deolalikar. He designed the building, and some elements you can see are being replicated from the Rashtrapati Bhavan, some elements being, so they have a huge lineage of history. You can relate the Chhatri all the way to Fatehpur Sikri. You can relate the dome to the dome of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. This is the Vigyan Bhavan, which was again done by CPWD in 1955. And you can see a very, very revivalist motif right at the entrance, which is the entrance of the Chaitya Hall. And you can see that how architects were relying on mixing different styles of architecture to create interesting buildings in Delhi. This, I think you must have all seen, is the Ashoka Hotel, again done in 1955 by an architect called E.B. Doctor. So CPWD really became, and I think this period, when we talk of this period from 1947 to about 1980, for me personally, I also find it very interesting because really speaking, more than private architects, it was the government architects who were doing very, very interesting work. And they were really the ones who were responsible for really the expansion of the city, for making new buildings. So I think private practitioners at this point were doing very small work, and it was the government architects who were making very, very interesting work. So this is a very large expansion that was undertaken by CPWD, which is the entire diplomatic enclave, which came southwest of Rashtrapati Bhavan, and almost 1,570 acres of land was allotted for making foreign embassies of all the different countries. And there were several rules set on how land would be allotted to different embassies. But that was the entire scope of work for CPWD. I mean, no other government department, we have seen recently undertake such big kind of work. And this diplomatic enclave, the Chanakyapuri, became a site of very interesting architectural pieces. And if you have driven around, you may, from the road, it's not so visible, but they're very, very interesting pieces of architecture. And it is almost, I call it an exhibition of architecture, because not only did it give opportunity to Indian architects, but it also gave opportunity to all the leading architects from all across the world to come and make buildings. And here is a very classic example of the American embassy. This is a picture probably taken in 1950s. There are no boundary walls. You can see from the road all the way to the building, and you can never get this view in today's time. And he made a very classical building made with jali, which is surrounding the entire building, and a very cantilevered roof on top. This is another building, which is the Polish embassy, designed by a Polish architect called Witold Czechiewicz's. And you can see the simplicity. Again, remember the different virtues that I told you about modern architecture, the flat roof, the straight lines, and also one of the things which you will observe in modern work is the kind of expression of a structure. You can see the columns, you can see the beams. So it kind of really elevates architecture to another level. So while the government was facing this kind of a revivalist phase, there was a handful of intellectuals, handful of architects practicing in India who thought that, modernism should be embraced by architects, and revivalism is not something that architects should do, because modernism and modern forms will be best suited to express the optimism of a new nation. And so here you see a few of the architects who kind of spearheaded this movement, where on the left, on the top is Habib Rahman, who was the chief architect of Government of India, CPWD. And below him is the image of Mr. Mahendra Raj, who was a very eminent engineer. He actually designed the Hall of Nations, which got demolished last year. And I think his value is very important because he was instrumental in making architects realize their modern projects. It was his contribution which really single-handedly kind of created the history of modern architecture in India. Some other examples, Achyut Kanvinde at the bottom, who is referred to generally as the first modern architect of India. Shivnath Prasad on top, who was a die-hard fan of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier is the architect who designed Chandigarh and several other works. And Raj Rawal on the right, maybe you have heard his name, but as we go along, we'll see some projects designed by all these different architects. So the first architect which I'm going to talk about is Habib Rahman, and you can see the picture on the left with Nehru explaining to him the plan of Rabindra Bhavan, or the Lalit Kala Academy, which is at Mandi House Crossing. And as the chief architect of CPWD, he actually is responsible of at least 40 buildings which are spread all over Delhi, particularly in the ITO region, particularly in the New Delhi area, wherever there are any kind of government offices. And apart from the different offices that he built, you can also see the Mazar of Maulana Azad. He did actually the 3 very interesting memorials. One is the Mazar of Maulana Azad, Mazar of Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, and Mazar of the second president, Zakir Hussain. So the three mazars are very intricately designed. At the bottom, you see the WHO headquarters and the Rabindra Bhavan. So I'm going to quickly show you one example of his work, which is the multi-story housing located in RK Puram, right opposite the Hyatt Hotel. Any one of you have seen it? Any recollection? You've seen it. Are you living in RK Puram? So, okay. So, this is way back in 50s, and compare it to other government houses in Sarojini Nagar, in other areas. So this was one of the earliest ideas, earliest examples of high-rise housings which were made in Delhi. And, if you look at the plan, there are two types of housings. And you see the side plan at the top, which is the ring road at the bottom, and all the housing blocks located. So this is also one of the features of modern architecture as compared to traditional architecture. So if you've seen traditional cities, they're close, dense, compact. So you remember going to Old Delhi, you remember going to Banaras, or any other old city, you are moved by the closeness, the compactness of the city. Modern architecture, on the other hand, the building is set in open landscape. So there is space between buildings. So you can see within the plan how buildings are far apart from each other. And the whole idea is to take advantage of air, circulation, and light from all around. So you see the two types of plans, Y-shaped and T-shaped, and these were the two types of government type 5 and type 6 flats. These are about 8 stories high, very, very phenomenal at that point of time, because lift at this point was considered a very expensive, it was considered a luxury. And then people were very concerned how to maintain lifts. Even if you install lifts, then how would you maintain them? So at that point of time, this was a very bold experiment. And Habib Rahman not only designed this high-rise, but also designed several others at Kasturba Gandhi Marg as well. So here, one of the distinctive features, again, you can see the straight lines, you can see the flat roof, you can see the cantilevered balconies, which became a distinctive feature of this building. And also, you will be able to see the kind of expression of the structure, which is the vertical lines of the columns, etc. Here, I think you will get a sense of what I mentioned, the space between the buildings, the idea to bring in light and air. And at this point, air conditioning was not really readily used in houses, not even in buildings at all. So, the houses were designed primarily to allow ventilation to take place so that heat could be flushed out. This is North India, so the primary weather we design for is the hot, dry summer. This is another building, and this is the General Post Office at Patel Chowk in Delhi, and you can again observe the simplicity of its form and how they were making very, very simple and yet very bold architecture. Another example by Habib Rahman. This is a really bold, this is the Hindustan Times building at Kasturba Gandhi Marg. I think, now it's not even visible because there's so much foliage all around. You barely be able to see it, but look at the simplicity and the kind of bold work they were able to do in 1950s. I think I've already shown this one. This is the Rabindra Bhavan. And so here, I think this was an interesting turn in his career when he made the Rabindra Bhavan, which was the cultural center and art gallery. And Nehru personally intervened and kind of asked him to not only make modern architecture, but also blend in elements of Indian architecture. So you will be able to see certain materialities, certain elements which remind you of Indian architecture. For example, the use of jalis between the columns, the way the openings are at the bottom. These were really reminiscent of Indian architecture. And I think he was, while making this building, also very largely influenced by Rabindranath Tagore, who told him clearly that you should neither blindly imitate the West, nor blindly follow the past. The second architect I'm showing is Achyut Kanvinde, which, he was another very leading figure in Delhi, and he designed several buildings. And again, interestingly, all of these leading architects worked for the government at some point or the other. Habib Rahman almost spent the entire career working for the government, and all the projects you see were being made by government architects. So, I cannot maybe explain this to you, but if you compare what the government is doing today, it kind of really excites you to see what they were doing about 50 years back. And here is Kanvinde. He joined as an architect for CSIR, Center for Scientific and Industrial Research, and then he went on to also establish a private practice and did several interesting works all around Delhi. And you must have possibly seen the National Science Center, definitely, which is designed by Tanvinde, and another building in Safdarjung Development Area, which is the National Dairy Development Board. So this was one of the questions actually in the quiz. Maybe this is the only answer I knew. Who designed, yeah, there was a question on India International Center. So the architect was Joseph Allen Stein. He was an American architect who came to India in 1960s. And he then went on to make lots of interesting buildings all over Delhi. And really, if you look at his architecture, so the buildings we are sitting in, the India International Center has been designed by Stein. The Ford Foundation has been designed by Stein. The India Habitat Center has been designed by Stein. So all these are very, very landmark works by Joseph Allen Stein. So amongst the modernists, this is the last stream that I'm introducing to you. So these were some architects who were so-called real Corbusians. So they emulated Le Corbusier, who was a French architect, designed Chandigarh. And his architecture was very, very sculptural. His architecture was very structural. And also his architecture was totally using the reinforced concrete cement in a very rough manner, which was called a brutalist style. And a lot of the architects who practiced in Delhi, particularly two figures, Shivnath Prasad, who designed the Akbar Bhavan in Chanakyapuri and the Sri Ram Center for Performing Arts in Mandi House. So he was, kind of a person who followed Corbusier throughout his career. And the other architect who did that also was Kuldeep Singh, who designed the NDMC Civic Center. So this was a quick introduction to modern phase of architecture, but I think modernism didn't end there. And as architects in India practice modernism, they could see that a lot of modern ideas are not working in this context. A lot of, for example, you saw those buildings far apart, and they thought maybe, they get a bit too hot. They're not as comfortable as it used to be to live in traditional cities, where we lived in very compact cities. Each building shaded the other building. And in a sense, there was another kind of a level of comfort that you experienced in traditional architecture. So Indian architects at this point of time, this whole idea got spearheaded in Delhi by several architects like Ashish Ganju, Kamath, Raj Raval, who started to look at India's past architecture and tried to see and correlate how they could create architecture from the past examples. So they looked at different ideas of urban cities. For example, streets in Jaisalmer, which are very narrow, shading each other. There is a very, intricate hierarchy of spaces, how spaces flow into each other. They started to look at very interesting examples of Indian architecture, like the stepwells, which were places not only to draw water, but also became spaces of social gathering. They looked at different types of examples and typologies in Indian architecture. And thereafter, they started to create architecture which was really modern, but yet influenced by India's past. So several housing examples which you must have lived. Some of you must be living in those houses. Some of you must have seen them while driving by, are kind of influenced by that. This is the Golfview Apartments, which is presently called, but Malviya Nagar extension that it was referred to at in 1972. This was designed by Kuldeep Singh. And this is in Saket, so if anybody who lives there can easily come and look at it. But eventually, this building has all got plastered, so it's not so recognizable. It looks very, very different today. But you can see how an entire large portion of a city was created based on the Indian system of streets and squares and how people used to move and traverse space within cities. So this is another example of a housing project, Yamuna Apartments, by an architecture group called Design Group. This was again built in 1960s. And here again you can see how the entire plan was kind of generated out of a system of streets and squares where people could gather. You can see the photograph here of how children are playing in the intermediate space. Another example done by another architect, very famous architect who passed away last year, Charles Correa. He was one of the most eminent modern architects of India. And this is the housing which was called the Tara housing, built in Alaknanda, which is again based on a similar idea of Indian streets and squares. The last example I'm showing is Press Enclave, which is again located in Saket. Again, an idea of street and square and how Indian architecture influenced in the making of these different complexes. Sorry, this is the last example, the Asian Games Village by Raj Rawal. So, in 1970s and 80s, I think there was a huge spurt in development in Delhi. And the two events, one was the trade fair and one was the Asian Games in 1982, which kind of spurred building activity in Delhi. And here you can see again a small, in detail, the slides of Hall of Nations. And I think why this was a very significant building was, first of all, it was the only space frame done in concrete anywhere in the world. At this point, space frame actually is a technology which is made only in steel, but this was the only space frame which was made out of concrete, handmade concrete on site. So this was the stunning space which was made inside the building, and it became a large exhibition hall. And you can see the entire structural frame which is on the outside. Not only did it act as a structural frame, but it also acted as a filter to light. So light kind of penetrated through the entire filter, and there was diffused light within the entire space. So in the end, to conclude, I'm just going to reiterate why modern works are so important. And I have already touched upon it, but I think what is important to know is that the rich architectural heritage has been described in several places, but I think why, which I have already mentioned, why this era was very important was because most of the work was done by the government, and within the government, within the departments of the government, there was a sense of optimism to build really forward-looking, very, very progressive kind of architecture. Secondly, the other thing which makes this era very unique is, as compared to the West, where modern architecture was born out of a technological revolution, in India, modern architecture was almost handcrafted. You can see the picture here, how the entire Hall of Nations was erected, step by step, hand by hand, labor by labor. So you can see pictures of India International Center, of Akbar Bhavan. All these, if you see, were made by handicraft, made by craftsperson who really made it by hand and not really using very large machines at this point of time. Lastly, I again come back on the relationship between the architect and the establishment at this point of time. And it was a very, very intricate relationship. And the Prime Minister, the government, personally took interest in architecture, the making of the city, and which really resulted in very bold sculptural architecture, sometimes very, very fluid forms, sometimes extremely exciting housing, and sometimes also very, very unseen and unknown. This is a very, very hidden example of a Syrian Orthodox church in Hauskas. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.